Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Safe Defend Live. I am Dave Evans with the one and only Doc Greg Becky, and we are going to talk about the how today. We've talked about the what, the background is, but how do you conduct a threat assessment? And I'm really interested to hear this because I think all of our users, all of our listeners, all of the people out there that are trying to build a safer environment for their students and their coworkers will appreciate the how-to. So, Doc, what are the first steps and how do you go about setting up a threat assessment and conducting it properly?
Well, we've already, kind of talked about there's various like elements to this, right? Okay, so you've got to have like your threat assessment teams. We talked about that. You got to have some sort of a case management system. We talked about that. You got to understand that there's a process of determining someone's existence on that pathway to violence and how to do that. We've talked about that. And then what I want to cover today a little bit is, kind of like you said, the how-to. What's the flow chart? What's the flow chart? Because we can talk about process and forms and case management all day long, but if you don't really understand the structure, the how-to, then we're missing a big piece of it. And I want to just touch on that a little bit. There's basically, it's just a few steps really. And you got to remember that the threat assessment process is an investigation, right? It's a special form of investigation. And so what we have to do is that when we get confronted or we notice or it's brought to our attention that we have some concerning behavior, right? That makes us think, ooh, is this violent? Is this a real threat? Rather it's in a school or workplace. We got to, step one is to evaluate the threat, because the basic thing we're trying to do in threat assessment is distinguish between those who make a threat versus those who pose a threat, right? Making a threat doesn't necessarily mean you pose a threat, right? I mean, you hear all these, reports of like a bomb threat. Well, that's not a threat because it's fake, right? Or it doesn't really pose a threat. So that's kind of the first thing we want to look at. And so step one is basically we need to evaluate that threat, right? So simple things like you're going to go talk to the person who is of concern, because our priority here is to deal with that potential grievance or a grievance that may be bad enough that it results in like planning to do violence, right? So we got to figure that out, right? Next thing we want to do in part of the evaluation is interview any sort of witnesses that can help, look at other facts, documents, social media, things like this. And then we have to look at it in context, because here's the deal. There are a lot of people that make threats, especially kids. They get frustrated and they'll say stupid things, right? And sometimes they do it because they're just trying to be funny.
They're kids.
They're trying to get attention, right? Or maybe they're just angry or frustrated, right? And so they kind of lash out. They said, I'm gonna kick your ass, or I'm gonna kill you, or something like this, right? Now, that's definitely making a threat, but the question is, do they really pose a threat? And I'm here to tell you that statistically, and just, when we look at, especially with kids, especially at schools, 9 times out of 10, it's not a real threat. It's just an expression of frustration, right?
Yep.
And so we have to look to see, is there something that suggests an intent to do harm? Okay. So if someone says, I'm going to kill Billy or whatever, certainly you have to determine, oh yeah, well, he said that, sounds like a threat. Let's try to figure out the next thing. And this is the next thing. The step 2 is really the magic of this, where you can resolve nearly 90% of the threats, especially in schools. So what we're looking for to resolve it as a temporary threat. In other words, there's no lasting intent to do harm, right? And so we're looking for things, is it humor, rhetoric, hyperbole, frustration, anger? And when we confront that person in a nice way, but when we talk to that person in a caring way, what we're looking for is apology, a retraction, or just a rational explanation of the threat. And if you can get an apology from the person, like immediately, right? A genuine apology, or they basically said, okay, look, I take it back. I didn't really mean it. They retract it. or they can explain it in terms of how they were feeling at the time, then we can pretty much end the threat assessment right there. And that right there is really a key to avoiding false positives. You're making this assumption because the kid said, oh, they lost a football game, right? And he was on the other team. And
Right.
he gets angry and he says, you know what, I'm gonna kill that kid because he tackled me and he hurt me. He didn't really mean it. It was frustrating. So we can pretty much kill this whole threat assessment at that point as temporary. So that's about 80-90% of the problems you run into schools. Okay. Because kids don't have a life experience, and so they don't really have a way to deal with it as an adult would, right? And so we have that. Okay, now let's say that we have someone appears to make a threat. We go to step 2 and we try to resolve the threat, and we go up to him and say, hey, I heard or somebody mentioned or reported that you said you were going to kill Billy. He said, yeah. Well, what did you mean by that? Because I want to hurt him, right? So he doesn't apologize. He doesn't retract it, and he doesn't explain it in a way that we can push it off as a temporary threat. Then we have to go to the next step, okay? The next step is now we got to respond. Now we have, as far as we know, a substantive threat. And a substantive threat can be a number of things. And so we talk about targeted violence, right? So it could, when we're talking about, in this case, physical violence, right? So you could have non-deadly threats, right? And this is what you're going to find mostly in schools and even at the workplace. You get in a shoving fight or shoving match, hitting, fighting, things like that. We would consider those substantive, serious threats, okay? If it involves threats to actually kill, rape, grave bodily injury, or the implication that they may use weapons, now we're talking about a deadly threat, okay? And that really increases the urgency of what we need to do. So when you're looking at a threat and coming up whether or not it's substantive or not, these are some of the presumptive indicators that you're dealing with a real threat, okay? Number one, there is very specific and plausible details, okay? That's an indicator. Another indicator is that the threat has been repeated over and over again to multiple people. If it's reported as a violent plan, if the kid or the person of concern is trying to seek accomplices and things like this, trying to recruit an audience, and just any indication of real research and planning. Those are all presumptive indicators that you're not dealing with a temporary threat. So then we want to go on and then actually take action, right? And so for the substantive, like non-deadly threats, and pretty much for all of these, right, especially those immediate precautions to protect victims, right? So if there's an identified victim or target, you want to protect that person. That might be removing the person of concern, or doing something, right? So warning the intended victim and taking precautions to help and protect that person. And then, of course, look for ways to resolve the conflict, especially if it's just a non-deadly threat. It's kind of like a fight type stuff, right? How can you resolve the conflict? Is this frustration? And then, of course, if necessary, you discipline the kid, and that's pretty much it. And then you're basically done, right?
Well,
now,
I want to ask a question about all this, because we're kind of leaving out a piece that I think is really important, and I think it's very important, especially to schools. At what point do we bring the parents into the discussion? Because that's going to complicate things in my mind. But they have to be involved because they're minors, right? At what point do we notify the parents and bring them into the discussion, or do we?
Well, there's no requirement. You have to let the parents know. That's going to be a case by case basis. Okay. It's just like for discipline, right? You don't have to get parents' permission to do discipline. Threat assessment is not discipline. All we're doing is we're trying to determine the veracity of someone that may be threatened. Right. Now, in terms of like when it's more than just kind of a shoving match or whatever, it depends on the policy of the school or the workplace, right? Okay. There's nothing wrong calling the parents, It kind of has to be, because the parents could also help in the threat assessment, especially if they're willing to help. And even part of the threat assessment process is an interview sheet for the parents, right?
Right.
But again, it's contextual, and it really depends on the situation, because some parents are no help. Some parents will actually try to step in and interfere with your threat assessment. They might give you false information and things like this. So really, there's no, I hate to say, well, it depends, but it really does. It depends, right? Certainly, if you have a parent that is clearly concerned, is genuine, wants to help, I would want to have them on our side, because they can do things at home that we can't do, right?
Yep.
But if we're talking about, moving on here now, to a deadly type threat, okay, really the only thing we're going to do beyond that is that now we're going to really do a clear safety and risk assessment evaluation of that person or that kid. We're going to screen them for mental health services and counseling. This is where law enforcement would probably get involved, especially if there's evidence of planning and preparation. And we have a safety plan, and we put together a safety plan. And then when you implement the safety plan, basically you're documenting everything, and you have certain objectives, and you monitor it. And now this person is now clearly on our radar. And then also from there, you determine whatever appropriate intervention might be best. That's pretty much it. Very easy, about 5 steps. I would probably say that, the areas where people have issues with the threat assessment is they don't take the time to resolve it as a temporary threat. They just skip right into, oh my God, he said that. And now we do too much intervention, and we overreact. And so I see that as a problem, especially in schools, as an overreaction to what appears to be a threat. And then, of course, just choosing the appropriate intervention for the situation. If the kid says, I want to kill Billy because I lost a football game or whatever, you're not going to call the police, right? That would be inappropriate at that point, right? And so you also have got to manage your interventions and make sure they're appropriate for the given threat level that you have. That's pretty much it.
Yeah, I think this isn't overly complicated. It's about having a conversation. A situation comes up, you have a conversation, see if there's real intent. If there isn't, tell them you shouldn't say things like that, basically. If there is, and next step is to bring them in, have the discussion, develop a safety plan, notify the right people, and giddy up. I mean, and make sure you're being an adult in the situation. I think some of us lose sight that being adult sometimes is showing grace and keeping an eye on things and building a plan to make sure something doesn't happen. And if it escalates, then knowing when to intervene.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point, because at the end of the day, we've got to remember, we're not dealing with some, crazy psychopath serial killer. We're dealing with kids and people that we know, people that we love. They're frustrated and they get into crisis. And again, the best thing to do under any circumstance is to help them and be there for them and be that social support.
It's a fact. Well, Doc, great episode on how to conduct a threat assessment. I hope you have a great weekend. I'm sure I'm going to. We're going to go head up to the little vacation place for a couple of days and work from there and get some stuff work done up there as well. But man, it was great seeing you again, Doc.
Same here. Have a great weekend.
Right. Talk to you later, brother. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.